My first experience with Final Fantasy VII was through playing the remake. Now that statement has a number of exceptions to go along with it, but I'm not going to list them all, because what I want to convey to you up front is that when I played through the FF7 Remake for the first time, I didn't know what to expect, I didn't know who the characters were, and at every point along the way, I was excited to see something new for the first time. And that means my playthrough of the game had a very different experience from someone who grew up playing it. And what really struck me on my first playthrough is how negatively I viewed Avalanche and Barrett. I really didn't like them for the first half of my first playthrough. Obviously not because they were poorly acted, like their voice actors were great, but because their actions and reasons didn't convince me. And I really thought they were the bad guys alongside Shinra. So I wasn't really expecting Barrett to turn out the way he did. Our first impression of Barrett goes something like this. After the fantastic opening sequence, which is one of the best I've ever seen, we meet Cloud, our main character, and Barrett is really the first one to interact with him. But Barrett is both standoffish and kind of hostile to Cloud. And so that doesn't really leave a great first impression, but it's not a big deal. But aside from his shoving Cloud around, Barrett really finds his introduction in the loud, passionate speech he makes in the elevator. Within this enclosed space, we see Barrett looming large, dominating the area. He speaks very loudly beyond what is required or is appropriate within that enclosed space. And he makes gestures towards Cloud to draw him into giving a desired response to what he is saying. All this is to say is that Barrett is using his physicality and the space and his voice to kind of manipulate Cloud, you could say, to be drawn into his conversations and the reasons for why he's doing his actions. And that's kind of a lot of red flags, because it's a very inappropriate kind of location to make that kind of speech. And when we see Cloud basically just dismissing Barrett, it gives us this impression of hostility between the two. But this scene also is our introduction to Mako energy, which is foundational for the justification for Barrett and Avalanche's actions. Well, if you've played FF7, or you know the series, you probably understand what Mako is. But for a new player, Barrett's speech doesn't elucidate the nature of Mako very well. He talks about it being the lifeblood of the planet bleeds green as you or I bleed red. But like Barrett in his gesture and the way he conducts his rhetoric is not convincing, it's off-putting. It makes me not believe him. In fact, on my first playthrough, I just thought that Mako was a stand-in for oil or gas. And while it's like, okay, that's cool, there's an eco or environmental connection to our real world, that's not generally enough to justify the bombing runs that we see in the opening chapter. And this becomes crucial, because in this opening chapter, we are blowing up a reactor. And so if Mako is simply a stand-in for oil or gas, like it sucks that gas and oil is destroying our planet in a very slow kind of grinding way, but like it's not justification for blowing up an oil rig, right? And so without the proper understanding of Mako as an energy source, you don't have the full justification for the actions that we participate in this first chapter, despite the whole chapter being a lot of fun. The negative opinion of Barrett and Avalanche's actions is increased when we see the carnage in a first-hand account in Chapter 2. Yes, Shinra made the explosion way worse for their own political agenda, of course. But walking through the streets of Sector 8 and seeing all the damage that the explosion caused really triggers memories of 9/11. Now this is super fascinating, and I'll just say I'm not American and I've never lived in America, so it's a bit different from an outsider's perspective. The original Final Fantasy VII occurred before that attack, and so it's not nascent in the player's interpretation of the game, because it's an event that occurs afterwards. But that later interpretation becomes interwoven with the remake, where people who have lived through 9/11 will not help but see it in some capacity in Chapter 2. Or at least, as an outsider, not an American, that was pretty obvious to me at first glance. And I don't think that's the message of FF7 Remake, of course. but it's just something that's there in the player experience if you have experienced that event, or you can substitute 9/11 with some other attack and have that kind of devastation hit closer to home through those experiences. It is one of the interesting ways that an interpretation of the game will be shaped by events that occur after its release. So when you pair the undercooked reasoning for why Barrett and Avalanche are doing what they are doing, and then you also take this overt walk through the carnage of what you've produced, it made me as a first-time player really dislike Avalanche and really be like, I don't want to be a part of this group. I don't want Cloud to be a part of this group. But our introduction to Barrett doesn't quite end there. In Chapter 2, we also see him give a speech to the members of Avalanche that really raised some red flags with me. He and his group just downplay the damage their actions cause and justify it within the goodness of their overarching scheme. This has to have helped the planet somewhat. And then Barrett places himself as the nexus for their troubles. He says, I'm here to take the load off your shoulders. Whatever problems you have, console in me, and I'll be the one to help you through it. This is a very big kind of red flag, and if you see the title of the video, is a bit of a cultic behavior where a main charismatic figure sort of embodies themselves as the center to the solution of all the activities of the members of the cult. You can actually see later on in Chapter 5 that Barrett distances the damages that they do from their own actions when they're about to get on the train, and Barrett just says, it's not on us, it's not on us. And even after the plates fall, he still just goes, whatever came before, it's Shinra who pulled the trigger. Which is true, but it downplays the escalation that he and Avalanche contributed to the whole situation. Shinra wasn't planning on dropping the plate. They dropped it as a response to the escalating attacks from Barrett and Avalanche's cell. And so to downplay their involvement in that is also a red flag. We also see that Barrett repeats his intimidating presence, both with the Shinra middle manager, who by the way is the best middle manager, because he towers over them when they're sitting down. He scares them. Partly because he has a gun for an arm, and partly because he's this large, towering figure. And his interactions are accompanied by a very threatening tone. So of course he's going to scare the managers, because he's scary. And then finally we see this repeated at the end of Chapter 3, where Tifa and Cloud are at the bar, and Tifa talks about how she feels trapped, and Barrett comes up behind, and he stands over them as they're sitting down at the counter, and gives Cloud his money. Just the way he's positioned, the way it's framed, he's intimidating, he's kind of scary, he's cold, he's hostile. It contributes to a poor initial reception of his character. When we are introduced to Avalanche in Chapter 1, Jesse brings up Cloud's relationship to Tifa. Because Cloud's relationship with the other members of Avalanche is cold and distant, that creates an expectation of a contrast for Cloud's relationship with Tifa that is kind of backed up by the brief flashback. I'm expecting, as a first-time player, for Cloud and Tifa to have a warmer relationship with each other than whatever Cloud is having with these Avalanche members. And when we actually get to meet Tifa, we find that yes, her and Cloud do have a closer relationship, a friendship even, but that Tifa is a very caring person. Not only does she care for Johnny in the brief scene that we get to see with them, but she's also someone who cares for the neighborhood and the neighborhood watch. And so she really puts on this caring duty within her community. And so by the end of Chapter 3, Tifa is very endeared to the player because of her character and because of the warmer relationship with Cloud. So when we see in the aforementioned cutscene, Tifa expresses her disagreement with Avalanche's method to agree to disagree. Immediately prior to that, though, we encountered Jessie, who treats Tifa in a very condescending manner. Her heart isn't in it, you know? She can't be relied on. If, push comes to shove, Jessie would prefer Cloud, who could fight, rather than Tifa, who is soft-hearted. And that single exchange just makes me really mad at Jessie. I really don't like her character for the way she treats Tifa like this. Because when you look back on Tifa as a character, and I'll pause here to say, FF7 Remake was my first experience, but I've gone back and played, well, most of FF7 since then, and I've replayed the remake on a few occasions. Tifa lost her entire town and family to the Shinra and Sephiroth instance. She endured so much trauma, and she had to wander from Nibelheim to end up in Midgar on the other side of the world. And instead of fostering anger and revenge, she still ends up being a loving and caring person who is nevertheless driven by this conviction that the world needs to change, that Shinra needs to be stopped, or that being a part of this avalanche cell is the way forward. And alongside of that, she just wants to prevent unnecessary death and injury. She doesn't want to kill people, she just wants to stop the burning of Mako, because she knows the pain of losing people who are near and dear to her. And we see this most evidently soon after in Chapter 5, when she says to the Shinra middle manager that she doesn't want anyone to die. So to see Jessie treat her within that context with disdain is just like, ugh, that really irks me. Jessie, meanwhile, is such an interesting contrast, and I don't want to build on this too much. I would rather other people just sort of reflect on it as well. Jessie, of course, lost her father, who fell into a coma due to Mako. But she still has a mother to take care of, they still have a home, and Jessie completely radicalizes and becomes unconcerned the victims of her own actions. Jessie lies to her own mother, saying that she still works at the Gold Saucer as a stagehand, and that it's an important work, but it's all a cover story to cover up her radicalization as a, bombing expert. And so I think that comparison between Tifa, who lost everything but is still a caring person, and Jessie, who lost a little bit but is a completely radicalized person, is very fascinating. To bring it back on topic, Jessie's treatment of Tifa is just another one of those, I really dislike this avalanche cell, but it's mostly just Jessie and Barrett up until that part of the game. But issues arising from within the game are not the sole reason why my impression and interpretation of Avalanche was so poor. And why am I making this connection between Barrett and a cult leader? Well, that's because I knew a cult leader. This cult leader was a pastor at a church, but they were overtly narcissistic. So this narcissistic pastor was incredibly charismatic, drew a lot of people into this church, and I'll admit this church experience was actually really great because they really cared about serving the community and the poor and the needy. But this narcissist infected it with his soul sickness, because behind the scenes this pastor was enacting these power schemes to get de facto control of the hierarchy of the church and transform it into kind of a brand with himself at the center. He wanted to make it into a franchise to grow it nationwide. And all this was built on his leadership and his contributions and his vision. This person had a presupposition that their actions were by default good. They could never be bad because, by definition, their own actions must be good. So they had this great marketing strategy of distancing any hurt that they caused from their vision or their goals or their own actions, and instead they would gaslight the people they hurt into thinking that it was actually them and not the church leadership that was causing all these problems. And they drew a wedge between the kind of ordinary person that was attending and liked the community and liked the serving the wider community. This wedge sort of filtered out people who disagreed with this cultic narcissist and people who bought into his plan. Even if you had people who spent years of their life serving within this church community, once they started to disagree with this cultic narcissist, they were cut off entirely, and their entire contributions were not only forgotten, but treated as if they never happened at all. And so this cultic, narcissistic person infected the entire community and rotted it from the inside and disfigured it and ruined basically all of its good points. And I can say this because I was actually attending that church community, and I got to see that transformation occur in real time. In fact, that was during the lockdown years and just leading up to it, and it was leading up to FF7's release on PC. So all of these experiences were sort of there in my memory when I played this game. And I got to see over the course of a year and a half how a social community of people that is pretty well off can become changed into a sour, divided disaster. And it was so interesting, now that I look back on it, to see how so many people wanted to hold on to the goodness that they saw in the community, that they were able to turn a blind eye to this sickness that was infecting it. Because this narcissistic infection occurred slowly and incrementally and used very good marketing ploys to hide its trajectory and its malice and its control. And like a lobster who is being boiled, you don't notice it right away, and when you do start to notice it, it becomes too late. So, a year in, you really feel trapped, and you don't know how you got trapped because you were unable to see it or unwilling to see these small incremental changes build up into something awful. And that experience was so interesting because for the longest time we could not name or pinpoint the sickness. And when we did, and when we tried to confront it, we were one of those who were driven out. Some of us left quietly, others did not. Some stayed to help others leave, and others were just cut out of the community. And so I don't want to linger too much because this isn't about my experience in a church that became a cult, but it is useful to sort of explain why I viewed Barrett in the way that I did. And I want to linger actually on this. Literature, and I think a video game is a piece of literature in this regard, can be interpreted by an individual, and that interpretation becomes a self-reflection. I really love the way that Paul Ricoeur talks about it. He says the interpretation of a text is the self-interpretation of a subject who thenceforth understands himself better, understands himself differently, or simply begins to understand himself. And truthfully, that is exactly what happened with me. The game of FF7 Remake mediated my experiences back to me. And so when I encountered Barrett and Avalanche, and when I encountered Tifa, and I encountered Jesse and Biggs and Wedge, they reflected back my experiences in this church that was becoming a cult. It, in a proper way, triggered me. It triggered my emotions and my memories, and it helped me to process them in a new and therapeutic manner. And I just kind of want to say, people like Biggs and Wedge, I saw people like that in that church who were completely loyal to the cause of this new cultic direction, but they were really good people. And it's this very interesting dichotomy that a very good person can become interwoven and entrapped by a very sick cause. So, I think I had a very interesting experience because, for me, the relationship between Barrett and this cult leader were just overt and obvious because my experiences were filtered back towards me. And I'll hazard a guess to say that your interpretation of Barrett and Avalanche was not like that on your first playthrough of FF7. Because you probably weren't trying to leave a cult. And I think this is one of the very good benefits of reading literature, whether a book or a game or a movie or a play, because it helps us understand ourselves better. So here's the thing. Barrett's not really a cult leader. And that's part of the title of this video. He's not. He kind of seemed like one because my experiences led me in that interpretive direction. And for the rest of the video, I want to talk about why isn't Barrett a cult leader? Because I think that's a fascinating question. And I think there is a very big reason, a very obvious reason, that hinges on how you treat other humans. Barrett actually cares about other people. And this narcissistic cult leader could not. This narcissist could only see other people as disposable tools. You either helped his vision or you were gone. Like, you had no value as a human. You only had value as someone who pushed his vision forward. But Barrett has genuine concern for the people around him. And there are so many scenes that depict this throughout the game that it makes Barrett a very wonderful character, but a complicated one. You can see the way that Barrett treats Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge as cherished friends, not disposable pawns. After the plate falls, he talks about how Biggs and Jesse were meant to return to us in a very powerfully and emotive scene. And when he encounters Wedge just prior to that, he gives a sigh of relief and goes, "Thank God that he's still alive." And it shows this genuine care for them. Because I brought up the scene of Barrett standing over Tifa and Cloud in this intimidating presence, I want to balance that by looking at how Barrett interacts with Tifa post-platefall, because he comforts and consoles her. Her suffering matters to him. And I don't want to fully explore this dynamic. I would just rather say, next time you play this game, look at how they interact after the plate falls. It's super fascinating. But I think the best example of Barrett's care for others is this really interesting symbolic action that occurs in Chapter 2. Because from the beginning of the game up until this point, Barrett has been cold, he's been distant, he's been hostile, and that is symbolized by having glasses that cover his eyes. Now, we don't need to make this into a grand overarching metaphor, but it is interesting to pay attention to the first time he removes his glasses. It coincides with a speech to Cloud that starts with him talking about the big pizza in the sky, and Cloud says, "Well, just leave. It always worked for me." And Barrett takes off his glasses and says, that's all well and good if you're only out for yourself, but folks down there aren't so lucky. And it's as if to suggest to us as players that this statement forms a core heartbeat for Barrett, the real Barrett. Barrett isn't out for himself. He's not consumed by his own illusions for glory. He's invested in looking out for those who cannot defend themselves. There are a few other really cool things about Barrett. He is a ball of pent-up emotions, and is really prone to explode. But often when he is on the verge of doing so, his friends come in to stop him. And this is the key. Barrett actually listens to them. In the opening of Chapter 5, Barrett is stopped by Cloud when he's talking to the Shinra middle manager. And Barrett just respects it and takes it and sits back down. Later in Chapter 15, Tifa stops Barrett from making a scene at the news that Avalanche is a puppet for Wutai, and Barrett relents. And I think the best characterizing moment for Barrett occurs in Chapter 2, when he interacts with the Shinra middle manager. Because in that scene, the manager replies with conviction that you can only change the world through peaceful means, and Barrett has nothing to say in reply. Barrett actually loses that exchange and sits down in frustration. And these are indications that Barrett's not a narcissist. And I think that narcissism is a very core component in becoming a cult leader. You really cannot become a cult leader if you genuinely care and are compassionate for others. And you certainly really can't be a narcissist and accept that kind of blatant defeat by someone who calls you and your methods into question. Barrett doesn't gaslight him. He doesn't have anything to say because he feels convicted by this opposing conviction that is being shared with him by this manager. And so Barrett has a sense of humility, has a sense of trepidation that is important for his character. And I think it is funny as hell that Barrett, as a fictional character, is actually more caring and compassionate than this real, literal person who I know. Even funnier than that is that Barrett is likely more compassionate as a character than I am. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about literature, is that we see these characters who are better than us in many regards in real life, that we can reflect upon. So let's talk about Barrett for a little bit to end the video. Barrett is a lot like Tifa and Cloud. He lost his hometown to Shinra, save for Marlene. And Barrett also made his way to Cosmo Canyon, and eventually across the world to Midgar. But he learned the truth about Mako. It's not just a stand-in for oil, it's literally the life essence of the planet. You are burning literally life itself in order to create energy. And that is a fundamentally different problem than destroying the environment by burning fossil fuels. And it makes the dramatic stakes for what Shinra is doing so much greater. So Barrett learns about what Shinra is doing, he learns that they're literally killing everyone alive, and then he looks around and sees that there are not really many people who are doing anything to stop it. He says Avalanche was founded in Cosmo Canyon in the original game, but even within Avalanche, he's not content because they're not doing real action, and so he forms a splinter cell. Barrett stands up to fight and to lead the fight because he sees an absence of leadership. There is a void, and no one is stepping in to fill it. Barrett is the kind of character who feels the need to step in and take charge when no one else is doing it, because this issue is so important. And he doesn't do it out of personal ambition, but forced to out of necessity and conviction. But I don't think this makes Barrett a good leader. In fact, I think what Barrett does is that he projects outwards an expectation of what a leader has to be, and then he performs that role. He creates a cold, distant persona that uses these wacky, charismatic speeches to inspire others. And then I think that persona is not who he really is, and we see him trying to balance that persona with his true self throughout the first part of the game. Because how Barrett acts and talks in the first part of this game, when he's the leader of this Avalanche cell, is actually quite different from how he acts after the plate falls, after he loses his team, and he's no longer a leader. But this persona of leadership that he is trying to maintain is why I got so many red flags, because he's not a good leader. And I think his relationship with the Avalanche cell is kind of toxic, because he is relating to them through this persona of this leader that's actually not quite effective or even beneficial. He is radicalizing these normal people, or facilitating their radicalization, in order to do these bombing runs. And I think he feels guilt about that in some part too. And so I think it is very appropriate to critique Barrett in Avalanche in the first part of the game. But that is a context from which his character grows. Or that's really where we pick up with his story, but that's not where it ends. And Barrett's journey is one of growth from a leader position, and a toxic leader position, to one of a companion who finds a much more natural fitting context for his character and what he is trying to achieve. In the early part of the game, he talks about taking the load off the shoulders of his followers, but Barrett's journey is about him having the load of leadership taking off his shoulders, so that he can have a more life-giving relationship with those around him and still save the planet. And it turns out you don't have to blow up any more Mako reactors necessarily, because with Sephiroth and with Cloud and Aerith, Barrett gets swept up into this new path of resistance that then draws us through the rest of the Final Fantasy story. So here at the end we can say, Barrett losing his Avalanche cell is a vector for growth. He is forced to change and forced to become better and forced to begin to look at himself and to confront the guilt that he may have over the actions that he takes. If I recall correctly, that is the path he goes in the original, and I'm curious to see how Rebirth does it when it comes to PC. Those of you who have already played it will obviously know better than I. And so that moment where the plate falls is a heartbreaking and tragic moment, but it also liberates Barrett from this kind of quasi-toxic relationship he has with Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, who he really cares about. He deeply cares about them. But his relationship to them as a leader is just not a good one. And it's one that really needs to change. Barrett needs to drop his persona and become who he really is, a fun and quirky and caring, a very fatherly character. And this is one of the great things about stories, is that we are introduced to characters who we come to love in contexts where they are not thriving. We get to see them in a situation that needs to change, and we see them grow. And that growth and change endears us to the character. So it's not Barrett with an Avalanche, it is Barrett with an Avalanche who then grows outside of Avalanche and progresses to become who he really is along this journey that we take with him and the others. And through this progression, Barrett is one of my favorite characters from this game, and I hope that he continues to be a really great character in Rebirth. So if I could end this video with some kind of lesson that goes beyond the game, it would just be to remind you that the banality of evil exists. Boring, unassuming, near imperceptible events, experiences, and relationships travel on a trajectory that will build up to cause great damage and harm, whether in a social group setting, whether in a national setting, or whether in a very personal, individual, relational setting. So throughout ordinary life, these unassuming moments accumulate together to create real damage, real harm, and real hurt. And it's very difficult to see it and name it and address it. But this is a ghostly specter in human relationships that does need to be confronted and changed so that we don't build towards a trajectory of evil, but we sort of redirect it to create a beneficial one.